But first, of course, there's a lot of news going on this week. And on Monday, President Donald Trump introduced to the nation and the world his pick for the next justice on the Supreme Court, a judge by the name of Brett Kavanaugh. What are the kind of the optics surrounding this and thoughts on how the process may move forward, how the parties are looking, so on and so forth? Let's turn to Roshini Rajkumar. She's a good friend of the program. She's a personal brand strategist and presence engineer who works with business, sports, and healthcare executives. She's also a licensed attorney, so she's got some legal insights, and the author of Communicate That, Your Toolbox for Powerful Presence. And she is the one that companies call to coach executives so that they don't make mistakes in today's 24/7 news cycle. Somebody who really understands how media works. Her website, ownyourwow.com. And as I understand it, Roshini, it's Own Your Wow Wednesday. So happy Own Your Wow Wednesday.
Thanks, Jimmy. It is Own Your Wow Wednesday, and it's just that day of the week where, every day we want you to own your wow, but it's that day of the week that is especially important to really look at yourself, look what you're doing, look what you're saying. How is your brand playing out in the marketplace, or how is your brand playing out with your family, your friends, and really own it. Use it for good. Use it for the better of your own brand and your own intentions. Just, a nice little midweek check on what you're doing.
I think it's a great idea. When did you start the idea? I know Own Your Wow's been your website for a while, but
yeah. Own Your Wow is really my mission, and I want to say, maybe at the end of 2017, I started really focusing on these Own Your Wow Wednesdays. Later today, I'm going to be on a Minneapolis TV station talking about how to own your wow in crucial conversations, maybe sticky conversations with your boss or other coworkers or even with your family members. So really reminding people that you have it within you to communicate well, to be empowered, whether in personal situations or business situations. And, obviously someone who tries to own his wow, I think, every day is President Donald Trump. It plays out in various ways in our headlines.
Yeah, that's certainly putting it one way. That's for sure. That's for sure. So, I want to talk about this selection process for the judiciary, specifically for the Supreme Court of the United States. But before we get to the process and so forth, what did you make of the selection of Brett Kavanaugh?
Well, it was a safe pick. I was really hoping he would do something inspirational, and nothing against Judge Kavanaugh, but I really was hoping he would do something different. And many are saying this was, basically a Justice Kennedy anointed kind of person. And so he was the guy from the beginning. And we'll never really know. You're going to hear things, both sides on that, some trying to claim Donald Trump made this decision on his own. Well, there's a pretty deep process behind the scenes that's going on that most Americans aren't going to see on a daily basis, and reporters aren't reporting on, whether they even know about it or not. But as someone who went to law school, is a licensed attorney, has always had respect for the judiciary, it is a kind of a haloed part of our government. Even though it is equal to the other two branches, there's something extra special about the judiciary. And that's why the politicization of it, I think, is really not a good idea, because most judges, regardless of what's going on in current events, Jimmy, most judges care about their record. They care about their integrity, their ethics, how they are seen as decision makers on the bench. So, no matter who is going to be picked, I don't know that we're going to see all these precedents being overturned and things like that. I think that is where it really gets politicized, and that's not good for the country when these kinds of decisions get politicized, or reporters ahead of the selection, ahead of the naming of the president's nominee, start to sort of do the handicapping of it. And that's not great for the process, but I guess it does make good headlines.
From the legal perspective, when it comes to overturning precedents, particularly, for example, Roe versus Wade is a big one. I don't see that happening myself. I think that, you've got a jurist in Judge Kavanaugh who's just one of 9. It's not like he's the only guy that will be on the Supreme Court. It's not going to be the Kavanaugh court. So I think that he's not somebody who's going to take the idea of overturning long-standing 40-year precedent, 40-plus-year precedent, and moving forward with something that erodes that concept.
Exactly. And we've seen Justice Gorsuch has been on the bench now, on the Supreme Court bench for more than a year. He is not doing anything so drastic, at least in my opinion. And he certainly hasn't, led some kind of charge to overturn Roe v. Wade. And that's the point. Judges are not supposed to be activists. And most of them on the Supreme Court, they wait for the cases to come to them. Then they decide what they're going to hear. But they are not the ones who are protesting in the streets. They don't want their opinions publicly out there. At least if they're a good judge, that's not their job. So I think that we waste a lot of time. Members of Congress waste a lot of time worrying about this or playing those party politics right now. I think now, okay, the name is out there. Senate, go in and do your job. The Democrats probably will try to block it, although if they really can't find judicial reasoning, his record, his decisions, if they really find some sort of corruption, that's one thing. But if he has made good, solid decisions, then this is probably going to be put in, he's going to get confirmed fairly easily.
Well, let's talk about that process and the presentation from both sides. I mean, first of all, let's just concede one thing, that that the court has been exceedingly politicized by both sides of the aisle since Robert Bork in the 1980s, although you did have a remarkable approval, for example, in the 90s by Republicans of Ruth Bader Ginsburg, who to this day is seen as expected as one of the stalwart liberals on the court. You still had, I think it was 97-0 or something like that for Ginsburg, if I remember correctly, maybe one vote against her. But with a couple exceptions, we've seen it become more politicized since the 1980s.
Well, in the 1980s, I think we also saw more bipartisanship and compromise than we're seeing in the last decade or 12 years or 15 years or so. Definitely in the 80s, early 90s, there were many more things, negotiations happening across the aisle. We also had presidents that were in positions to make very inspired decisions like Ronald Reagan putting a woman on the Supreme Court, and the list goes on. These appointments don't happen every year. So when they happen, the president really has an opportunity. And the presidents who appointed some of those very inspired decisions, and when I say inspired, I'm not using it one way or another. It's just not kind of the norm sort of a decision, not a sort of just regular status quo decision. But those were needed in those times, right? So Ruth Bader Ginsburg, I'd have to look back at who was all in the Senate at the time, but there was probably a lot more bipartisanship and compromise, and probably, the Republicans probably said this one isn't worth a fight. I need to work with the Democrats on this other issue, so I'll confirm Ruth Bader Ginsburg. I mean, who knows what all was going on behind the scenes? We'd have to look that up. But it's not surprising to me that in the past these weren't so politicized, and they're getting, or for the most part, I know Bork and all of that process was highly politicized.
And Clarence Thomas as well.
Right, exactly. But yet, Clarence Thomas got in. So the bottom line is the last maybe 4 opportunities to appoint have become just, I think, crazy. I think Americans need to be reminded, as well as remind their members of Congress, that this is not supposed to be a highly charged political process. You're supposed to look at these judges. The Senate is supposed to look at these judges and say, are they making fair decisions? Have they been law-abiding citizens? Do they have a good record on their own over the course of their careers? What's their education like? So as much as it would have been wonderful to see another woman get appointed to the bench, of some of the finalists, or what we hear, quote unquote, finalists, one of those women didn't have as much experience on a U.S. Court of Appeals. So if you're going on experience, which I think you should, at the end of the day, gender should not matter. But I was hoping for a little more inspired of a decision, but I would be surprised if Judge Kavanaugh does not get affirmed, Jimmy.
Well, let's go back to your use of the word inspired of a decision. Personally, I think that President Trump did due diligence in a way that we haven't seen before. I know he's one of the lines of attack against Kavanaugh is that he was on this list that was put together primarily by the Federalist Society, but also with the Heritage Foundation involved. And that is something, for example, Elizabeth Warren has labeled as a far-right organization and so forth. Personally, I think that's him doing more due diligence than past presidential people in the past position of president that I was very encouraged by. And I found that, well, if Kavanaugh was part of this list, I found that to be a more inspired choice than in the past. At least I might use the word inspired.
Well, yeah, I mean, and like I say, that term is a bit subjective, but many people say, that the fact that someone was Justice Kennedy's former clerk also gives them a big leg up. And that's why I think there's some criticism that it wasn't an out-of-the-ordinary decision, even though the Trump folks are saying Justice Kennedy didn't make this decision for the president. Well, I would really think there's a lot of pressure, even if we don't hear about it or it's not admitted by the administration, to look at some of those factors. So that's what I'm talking about. There are a lot of judges out there. There are more judges that end up on that list who are qualified judges to be on the United States Supreme Court. But unfortunately, the position, it's such a high position, has gotten to be overly politicized. And I don't see that changing anytime soon, Jimmy.
We've got very, in some ways, I would say, likely to be vicious lines of attack that will be thrown at Judge Kavanaugh. He's already being criticized in part because he was on this Federalist Society list that was suggested to President Trump. You have them saying that there's a concern about President Trump nominating another justice to the court in the midst of the Mueller investigation. You have accusations flying that Roe versus Wade is going to end if Judge Kavanaugh gets on the bench definitively. I mean, that's something that if you look at Senator Elizabeth Warren or Cory Booker or Kirsten Gillibrand.
They are just adding fuel to the fire regardless. It is ridiculous. No judge just willy-nilly is like, yes, I'm going to really effort to overturn precedent, as you say, of 40-plus years. It's just ridiculous. It's just not in judicial makeup, in the chemistry of someone who becomes a judge. They become a judge because they don't want to be the president. They don't want to be the CEO of a company. They respect the law so much. They want to make sure the law is used well and interpreted well, properly, correctly, so that the rest of the country is living by those laws. So, I mean, it's ludicrous to me that either side bandies about this whole Roe v. Wade thing. It's something that I would be stunned if anything happens to that precedent.
So from an optical perspective, with these series of attacks that are coming from the Democrats and also obviously the Republicans and how they'll conduct themselves, what do you think is going to be, what would you be telling them if the Democrats and the Republicans came to you and said, Roshini, how should we present ourselves?
They should prepare smart questions so that all eyes will be on them questioning during the confirmation hearings, and they should ask those smart questions. They shouldn't ask sensationalistic questions, and all the money I hear is being spent and will be spent on these ad campaigns to convince 2 Republican senators of one thing or another. It is crazy. There's money, that's money better spent to help the poor, to prevent suicides that are rampant across our nation. So both parties need to really take stock and look at what they're doing and before they try to tear apart this man who I don't know him personally, but I've got to believe he respects the law and respects the Constitution and is probably pretty darn honored that he is a pick for the Supreme Court. So, I mean, I think the rest of us as Americans also need to look at our senators and other members of Congress and say, how much do you want to spend on time on this battle? Because there's so many other things that are so much more important to the nation than attacking one person because you have this crazy fear he's going to be part of some uprising against precedent. And let's look at Neil Gorsuch as the example. That's a Donald Trump appointee confirmed by the Senate. Let's look at the record of Judge Gorsuch, Justice Gorsuch. He has not been some kind of rampant conservative. I think that's where the Democrats need to look.
Interesting. Again, Roshini Rajkumar is our guest. She is a licensed attorney herself, but also a personal brand strategist and presence engineer, really knows how the news cycle works. And I want to shift gears here because there are others who really try to get into the news cycle to make points on issues of the day, and that is increasingly CEOs. Leaders of major companies and also smaller companies that get engaged very much in political activism. And this happens, it seems it's more pronounced these days on the left than on the right, but you definitely have more conservative CEOs and so forth that take positions on different issues, sometimes socially. You think Chick-fil-A and gay marriage and what have you is one more right-of-center example. What are you seeing right now as far as a phenomenon of CEOs going active politically and socially?
Yeah, it's really interesting, and I would say this is something probably the last 5 to 7 years we're seeing and hearing more about. First and foremost, if any leader, CEO of a huge corporation or owner of a mom and pop shop sees something that's happening, a current event, and if it's authentically connected to who they are as a person, or who their brand, their company really is and what it stands for, then it can make sense to put out some kind of public statement. Now, I think the larger of a company, the more it might be expected of you, especially if, here we are in these trade wars with China and your organization, like a 3M, for example, has offices, has some sort of many dealings with China, then it really does make sense for the CEO to say something because the rest of the world is probably watching. Now, if a leader just inserts him or herself into a current event or a news cycle just for the sake of doing it and there's no authenticity behind it, then that's really going to be seen as something strange. Like, for example, my husband and I were just talking about this, Elon Musk of Tesla. He was saying something about helping rescue the soccer team out of the cave with a submarine. I mean, like Elon Musk, the Navy, the SEAL divers there in Thailand were doing just fine without you. The world community came together and helped rescue those boys and their coach. I mean, the Elon Musk in that situation, Jimmy, was pretty ludicrous.
Yeah, although I don't know, I guess that's trying to be a hero, but that doesn't seem as much about political or social activism as trying to say, I want to be the hero of the day.
It's not the activism, but it is an illogical, kind of preposterous insertion of yourself into a current event.
Yeah, go ahead.
Well, I was going to get back to your point about the social activism. It's something, the rise and the high-profile suicides we've seen lately, and that is something that I don't think anybody would fault you for speaking about. If you are a CEO and you want to maybe add your voice to the landscape and make sure your people or maybe point out what your company is doing to work on mental health within your organization, I think that is a very appropriate and wonderful way to add to the dialogue, as long as it's true and it just didn't pop up last minute. Right? So it's judging your own voice as a leader, as a brand, before you jump into the fray, because depending on who that voice is, it can have a very powerful effect, but also depending on who the voice is, it can have a very detrimental effect. So each CEO needs to ask him or herself that before they jump in.
What about the potential negative consequences from people who say, want to have a backlash against the company because of the CEO's decision to go active?
Yeah, well, that's unfortunate when that happens, and that's always going to be a possibility. That's why really making sure it's authentically something you can speak about credibly. And then, remember, once we get our intent and our audience analysis down, who's going to hear it, see it, use the form, deliver the communication, whether it's online, a press conference, social tweets, or social posts. Do it in a way that your audiences will receive it and find it authentic. So, if you're not very good with public speaking, like obviously the past CEO of Wells Fargo, when he got in front of Congress, was not well prepared, and in some cases Mark Zuckerberg, when he did various interviews, you have to make sure you're well prepared for whatever the mode of communication is. If it's TV, print, social media, online, whatever, you've got to really think through, how do I deliver it authentically and powerfully in a way that's going to have the least damage to the brand? When you do that damage assessment, and you should do it ahead of time, if it seems like 90% of the world is going to attack you if you come out and say something, you know, you don't have to be a math genius to know those aren't good odds. Don't say something.
All right, real quick, just 45 seconds here. I have to ask you, because Bill and I talked about this yesterday, Roshini Rajkumar, and that is IHOP is now IHOP again after being IHOB, International House of Burgers. I think that was an epic fail from a publicity standpoint. Did you? Agreed.
Epic fail. If you have to explain that in your ad, I saw one of those ads recently. I was so confused by it. I don't know. I mean, anything like that will get some play on social. It will be interesting to see stock prices and what their numbers are in the next 6 to 12 months, Jimmy.
Somebody on Twitter tweeted out, if she's talking about going to IHOP, she's probably too young for you. So there you go.
I love it. So those are the funny things. If your brand can take the humor, you know, it's risky, but anyway, that's funny.
All right, Roshini Rajkumar, always great to check in with you. Happy Own Your Wow Wednesday. Thanks for joining us.
Thank you, Jimmy. Have a good one.
Thank you, too.